In 1871, a German geologist named Karl Moch stood before a structure that would change everything he thought he knew about Africa. Massive stone walls, rising 11 meters high, built without mortar, without cement. Perfectly fitted stones, precisely cut and carefully placed, stretching for over 250 meters. This wasn't supposed to exist. Not here. Not in Africa. European scholars had been taught that Africans were primitive, that they lived in mud huts, that they had no history, no civilization, no architecture. But here, in the heart of southern Africa, stood proof that everything they believed was a lie. The local Shona people called it Zimbabwe, houses of stone, the place of their ancestors, their sacred heritage. But Karl Moch couldn't accept that Africans had built this. So he did something that would echo through history. He lied. He claimed the stone smelled like his pencil, cedar wood from Lebanon. Therefore, he announced, this must have been built by Phoenicians, by King Solomon's miners, by the Queen of Sheba, by anyone at all, except Africans. And for over a century, that lie would be repeated by archaeologists, by historians, by governments. The evidence was ignored. The truth was buried. And one of Africa's greatest civilizations was erased from history, until the truth could no longer be denied. This is Great Zimbabwe. And this is the story of how racism almost destroyed one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Sit back and relax. Let me take you back to ancient Africa, to a civilization that built in stone, that controlled vast trade networks, that created a kingdom so powerful, so wealthy, so advanced, that Europeans simply couldn't believe Africans were capable of it. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe sits in the southeastern hills of modern Zimbabwe, about 300 kilometers south of the capital, Harare. In a landscape of rolling granite hills, scattered woodland, and endless blue sky. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists from around the world come to marvel at its massive stone walls. Archaeologists continue to uncover its secrets. And the people of Zimbabwe claim it with pride. It's on their flag, on their currency, in their national identity. But for centuries, its story was stolen. The ruins themselves are breathtaking. The site covers almost 800 hectares. That's roughly the size of 700 football fields. Scattered across this landscape are stone structures, walls, and enclosures built from granite blocks. The most famous structure is the Great Enclosure, an enormous elliptical wall, the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara. 250 meters around, 11 meters high at its tallest point. Built from over 1 million granite blocks. Each block carefully shaped to fit. No mortar. Just stone on stone, precisely placed. Inside this enclosure stands the most mysterious structure of all. A solid stone tower, conical in shape, rising over 9 meters high. We still don't know what it was for. A symbol of power. A grain storage facility. A religious monument. The tower keeps its secrets. Beyond the great enclosure, the site sprawls. There's the hill complex, built on a steep granite outcrop, offering commanding views of the landscape. There are smaller enclosures, residential areas, passageways between walls creating a maze-like structure. And everywhere, the stonework is remarkable. The walls have a distinctive herringbone pattern in places. Decorative stone towers called monoliths stand at intervals. The craftsmanship is sophisticated, showing advanced understanding of engineering, weight distribution, and aesthetics. But here's what makes Great Zimbabwe truly extraordinary. It wasn't built by a foreign power. It wasn't constructed by colonizers from distant lands. It was built by Africans, by the ancestors of the Shona people, between the 11th and 15th centuries, at a time when London was a small medieval town and much of Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a vast trading empire. It controlled the gold trade between the African interior and the coastal ports. It was connected to trade networks spanning from China to Persia, from India to Arabia. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, Arab coins, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, all here in the heart of Africa. This was a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, wealthy civilization. And it was undeniably, unquestionably African. But for over a century, European colonizers and racist scholars refused to believe it. And in their refusal, they nearly destroyed one of humanity's greatest archaeological treasures. To understand Great Zimbabwe, we need to go back. Back before the stone walls. Back to the people who would build this remarkable civilization. The story begins with the Bantu migrations. Over 2,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking peoples began spreading from West and Central Africa across the continent. They brought with them agriculture, ironworking, and new ways of organizing society. By the first millennium of the Common Era, Bantu-speaking groups had settled across southern Africa. In what is now Zimbabwe, they found a land rich in resources. Gold in the hills, iron ore in the ground, fertile soil for farming, wild game for hunting. These early settlers were skilled farmers. They cultivated sorghum, millet, and other crops. They kept cattle, which weren't just food, they were wealth, status, and spiritual significance. Even today, among Shona communities, cattle represent prosperity and are essential for important ceremonies. But it was iron that would change everything. The peoples of this region became master ironworkers. They mined iron ore, built sophisticated furnaces, and created tools and weapons of remarkable quality. Iron axes to clear land, iron hoes to cultivate, iron weapons for defense and hunting. Around the 8th century, something new emerged. Gold. The granite hills of Zimbabwe contained gold deposits, gold that could be mined, traded, and transformed into wealth. At first, the mining was small-scale. Individuals or families would dig for gold in surface deposits. But gradually, gold mining became more organized, more extensive, more profitable. And someone realized that whoever controlled the gold, controlled the trade routes, controlled the wealth, could control the entire region. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, a state began to form. Early centralized societies emerged, with chiefs who commanded labor, controlled trade, and accumulated wealth. These weren't primitive tribes. These were complex, hierarchical societies with political organization, economic systems, and social structures. The first major center was at a place called Mapungubwe, just to the south of where Great Zimbabwe would rise. Mapungubwe flourished between 1050 and 1290 of the Common Era. It was built on a hilltop, with the elite living at the summit and commoners below. Sound familiar? At Mapungubwe, archaeologists found evidence of long-distance trade. Glass beads from India and Persia, Chinese ceramics, Arab coins. The people of Mapungubwe were connected to the Indian Ocean trade network, that vast commercial system linking Africa, Arabia, India, and China. They were also creating remarkable art. The most famous artifact from Mapungubwe is a small golden rhinoceros, made from thin sheets of gold foil carefully worked over a wooden core. It's exquisite. It's now one of South Africa's national treasures. But around 1300, something changed. Mapungubwe declined. Perhaps climate change affected the region. Perhaps trade routes shifted. Perhaps political upheaval occurred. We don't know exactly. What we do know is that power moved about 300 kilometers to the north, to a new location, better positioned, more strategically located, to a place where granite hills provided natural defense and building materials, to a place with good grazing land, reliable water, and access to both the gold fields and the trade routes, to Great Zimbabwe. And here, the builders would create something unprecedented in sub-Saharan African architecture. They would build in stone. Not small structures. Not simple walls. But massive, sophisticated, permanent monuments that would last 1,000 years. The question is, why stone? Around them, most people built with wood, thatch, and earth. These materials worked perfectly well for the climate. They were readily available. But stone was different. Stone was permanent. Stone was power made visible. Stone said, "We are here. We are powerful. We will endure." And perhaps most importantly, the granite hills around Great Zimbabwe made stone building possible. The granite naturally exfoliates, meaning it splits into flat slabs perfect for building. You didn't need to quarry deep into the earth. You could collect stones from the surface, shape them slightly, and build. But this wasn't simple construction. The builders of Great Zimbabwe developed sophisticated techniques. They understood how to create stable walls without mortar, using carefully selected stones that fit together perfectly. They understood weight distribution, drainage, and aesthetics. This was architecture. This was engineering. This was civilization. Between 1100 and 1450 of the Common Era, Great Zimbabwe rose from the granite hills of southern Africa. And for 350 years, it would be the capital of an empire. The city grew gradually. The earliest structures were simple stone enclosures, probably for cattle. But as wealth accumulated, as power centralized, as the population grew, the building became more ambitious. The hill complex was built first. Perched on a steep granite outcrop, it served as the royal residence and religious center. To reach it, you had to climb a narrow passage between massive boulders and stone walls. It was defensible, commanding, impressive. Inside the hill complex, there are several enclosures. The western enclosure is the largest, with its own internal walls creating private spaces. This was where the king lived, where he held court, where he performed sacred rituals. Near the western enclosure stands a platform with 6 stone pillars, like monoliths reaching toward the sky. Archaeologists believe this was a sacred area, perhaps where ancestors were honored or divination was performed. Throughout the hill complex, there are narrow passages, secret corridors, and hidden chambers. This wasn't just a palace. It was a sacred space, a place of mystery and power. Below the hill complex, in the valley, the city sprawled. This is where most people lived. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of residents at Great Zimbabwe's height. They lived in houses with walls of clay or stone, thatched roofs, and packed earth floors. These weren't crude huts. Archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated living. Pottery of various styles. Iron tools and weapons. Gold ornaments. Imported goods. The people of Great Zimbabwe lived well. And then there's the Great Enclosure. The structure that would become Great Zimbabwe's most iconic monument. Building the Great Enclosure was an enormous undertaking. Over 1 million granite blocks had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and placed. The outer wall alone required incredible labor. 11 meters high, 5 meters thick at the base, 250 meters in circumference. Think about that. 1 million stones. each weighing 10 to 50 kilograms. Carried by hand. Placed precisely. Without cranes. Without machinery. Just human labor, human ingenuity, human determination. Who did this work? The people of Great Zimbabwe and surrounding communities. This was a centralized state with the power to command labor. Likely, people came from across the kingdom, working in teams, perhaps as a form of tribute to the king. But this wasn't slavery. This was civic duty, collective effort, shared pride in building something monumental. The great enclosure served multiple purposes. It may have been a royal residence for the king's wives and children. It may have been a place for important ceremonies. The massive walls created privacy, security, and status. And inside stands the conical tower. 9.7 meters tall. 5.5 meters in diameter at the base. Solid stone, no hollow interior. Built with over 10,000 granite blocks. What was it for? We don't know. Scholars have proposed dozens of theories. A grain storage symbol. A phallic symbol representing fertility. A representation of a grain bin. A tower for divination. A symbol of royal power. The truth is, we may never know. The tower keeps its secrets, standing silent after 700 years. But whether we understand its purpose or not, its significance is clear. It was a massive investment of labor. It was visible from distance. It was unique. It was power made visible. Great Zimbabwe at its height was home to perhaps 10 to 20,000 people. That might not sound like much today, but in medieval Africa, this was a major urban center. The city was organized hierarchically. The king and elite lived on the hill complex. Wealthy families lived in the great enclosure and nearby stone structures. Commoners lived in the valley in simpler dwellings. This stratification was deliberate. Stone walls didn't just provide shelter or security. They communicated status. If you lived inside stone walls, you mattered. You had power. You had wealth. And the wealth was real. Great Zimbabwe controlled the gold trade. In the hills surrounding the city, miners extracted gold from surface deposits and shallow mines. This gold was formed into ingots or dust, then traded. But Great Zimbabwe didn't just export raw materials. Evidence suggests local craftspeople created gold jewelry, probably for both local use and export. These were skilled artisans, working metal with precision. The kingdom also exported ivory. The region had elephant populations, and ivory was highly prized in Asia and Arabia. Copper from mines to the north. Animal skins. Perhaps enslaved people, though evidence for this is less clear. And in return, trade goods flowed in. Glass beads from India and Persia. These weren't just decorations, they were currency, status symbols. Chinese porcelain and Celadon ceramics. Persian pottery. Arab coins. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, used as currency across Africa. These weren't accidental finds. Great Zimbabwe was plugged into the Indian Ocean trade network. This vast commercial system connected East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. How did it work? Traders from Great Zimbabwe would transport goods to the East African coast, to cities like Kilwa, Sofala, and Mozambique. There, Swahili merchants and Arab traders would exchange African goods for Asian luxuries. Great Zimbabwe didn't have direct access to the sea. But it didn't need it. The kingdom controlled the interior trade routes. It was the middleman, the hub, the power center connecting the gold fields to the coast. This trade made Great Zimbabwe wealthy. Very wealthy. The elite wore gold ornaments. They dressed in fine fabrics. They ate from imported ceramics. They displayed their status with glass beads and exotic goods. But wealth alone doesn't explain Great Zimbabwe's importance. This was also a spiritual center, a place of religion and ritual. The Shona people, descendants of Great Zimbabwe's builders, have rich spiritual traditions. Ancestors are revered and consulted. Spirit mediums communicate with the ancestral realm. Sacred sites connect the living to the past. Great Zimbabwe was such a place. The hill complex, with its hidden chambers and sacred platforms, was likely where kings performed rituals, consulted ancestors, and maintained spiritual power. Archaeologists have found evidence of ritual activity. Clay figurines, stone-carved birds, the famous Zimbabwe birds that now appear on Zimbabwe's flag and currency. These weren't decorative. They were sacred objects, possibly representing messengers between the earthly and spiritual realms. The Zimbabwe birds are magnificent. Carved from soapstone, each stands about 40 centimeters tall. They depict a bird, possibly an eagle, perched on a column. 8 were found at Great Zimbabwe, positioned on top of pillars in the hill complex. These birds were so important that during the colonial period, when Great Zimbabwe was looted, one bird was taken to Cecil Rhodes' house. It's now returned to Zimbabwe and is a national symbol. The birds remind us that Great Zimbabwe wasn't just an economic center or political capital. It was a sacred place, where earthly power and spiritual authority were intertwined. For 3.5 centuries, Great Zimbabwe thrived. It was the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa. It controlled vast territories and trade networks. It was a center of power, wealth, culture, and spirituality. And then, around 1450, it began to decline. Around the mid-15th century, Great Zimbabwe's power began to wane. The population declined. The massive stone walls fell silent. The city that had been the heart of an empire slowly emptied. Why? What happened to this great civilization? The truth is, we don't know for certain. Great Zimbabwe didn't fall to invasion. There is no evidence of warfare or destruction. The walls weren't torn down. The city wasn't burned. Instead, it seems people simply left. Gradually, over decades, moving away to new centers of power. Scholars have proposed several theories. Environmental stress was likely a factor. 10 to 20,000 people in one location require enormous resources. Food, water, firewood, building materials, grazing land for cattle. Great Zimbabwe's success may have made it unsustainable. The surrounding land may have been overgrazed by cattle. Forests cut down for fuel and building. Soil exhausted from intensive agriculture. Some evidence suggests a regional drought occurred in the 15th century. If rainfall decreased, crops would fail. Cattle would struggle. Water sources would dry up. Living at Great Zimbabwe would become difficult. Trade routes may have shifted. The coastal port of Sofola, which had been Great Zimbabwe's primary trading link to the Indian Ocean, faced competition from other ports. Portuguese traders began appearing on the East African coast in the late 15th century, disrupting established trade networks. If trade declined, so would Great Zimbabwe's wealth and importance. Political factors likely played a role too. Great Zimbabwe's power depended on the king's ability to control trade, command labor, and maintain spiritual authority. If any of these weakened, rivals could emerge. And indeed, they did. As Great Zimbabwe declined, new kingdoms rose. To the north, the kingdom of Mutopa emerged, controlling the Zambezi River Valley and northern trade routes. To the southwest, the kingdom of Bucha developed, eventually becoming the Rosvi Empire. These weren't conquerors. They were successors. The same people, the same culture, simply establishing new centers of power. The important point is this: Great Zimbabwe didn't disappear because Africans were incapable of maintaining civilization. It declined for the same reasons cities and empires throughout history decline. Environmental change, economic shifts, political transitions. This is normal. This is how history works. Rome fell. Athens declined. Angkor was abandoned. Maya cities were reclaimed by jungle. Great civilizations rise and fall. It doesn't diminish their achievements. But here's what makes Great Zimbabwe's story unique and tragic. When Europeans arrived in southern Africa centuries later, they found these massive stone ruins. And they couldn't, or wouldn't, believe Africans had built them. In 1871, Karl Marx stood before Great Zimbabwe's stone walls and made a decision that would shape a century of lives. He was a German geologist, an explorer searching for ancient gold mines. When he saw Great Zimbabwe, he was amazed. The stonework was sophisticated. The scale was massive. This was clearly the work of an advanced civilization. But Marx, like most Europeans of his time, believed Africans were primitive, incapable of such achievement. So he invented a story. He claimed the wood used in the lintels was cedar from Lebanon. Therefore, he reasoned, this must have been built by Phoenicians, those ancient Mediterranean traders. Perhaps even connected to King Solomon's mines, mentioned in the Bible. Never mind that the wood was actually African timber. Never mind that there was zero evidence of Phoenician presence. Never mind that the local Shona people had oral traditions clearly identifying Great Zimbabwe as their ancestor city. Marx's lie was convenient. It fit European prejudices. It allowed colonizers to claim that anything impressive in Africa must have been built by non-Africans. And the lie spread. Other Europeans visited Great Zimbabwe and repeated variations of the myth. Some claimed the Queen of Sheba built it. Some said ancient Egyptians. Some suggested Arabs. A few even proposed, absurdly, that it was built by a lost tribe of Israel. Anyone but Africans. This wasn't just ignorance. This was deliberate racism serving colonial purposes. You see, by the late 19th century, European powers were scrambling to colonize Africa. They needed to justify this colonization, to claim they were bringing civilization to primitive peoples. But what if Africans had their own civilizations? What if they had built cities, established kingdoms, created art and architecture? That would undermine the entire colonial project. So Great Zimbabwe had to be rewritten. Its builders had to be erased. The African achievement had to be denied. In 1890, the region was colonized by Britain through Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company. The colony was named Rhodesia, after Rhodes himself. And Great Zimbabwe became a propaganda tool. The colonial government promoted the idea that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancient white people. This supposed proof of ancient white presence in Africa justified white colonial rule. But there was a problem. The archaeological evidence contradicted the lie. In 1891, J. Theodore Bent, a British archaeologist, excavated at Great Zimbabwe. He found local pottery, African artifacts, no trace of Phoenician or foreign origin. He concluded, correctly, that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans. The colonial government was not pleased. In 1905, the Ancient Ruins Company was given exclusive rights to search for gold at Great Zimbabwe. These weren't archaeologists. They were treasure hunters. They tore through the site, digging randomly, destroying context, looking for gold and artifacts to sell. They caused immeasurable damage. Priceless archaeological information was lost forever. Artifacts were scattered. The site was treated as a quarry to be plundered, not a heritage site to be protected. Then, between 1929 and 1931, a British archaeologist named Gertrude Cotton Thompson conducted the first professional excavation. She was meticulous, scientific, thorough, and her conclusion was unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, the Shona ancestors. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, there was no evidence of foreign builders. None. She published her findings in 1931. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. But the Rhodesian government rejected her conclusions. They banned her book. They suppressed her findings. They continued teaching in schools that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancient non-Africans. This wasn't academic disagreement. This was state-sponsored censorship of truth. For decades, white Rhodesian historians continued to insist Great Zimbabwe couldn't be African. They published books claiming mysterious white civilizations. They created elaborate fantasies about King Solomon's mines and Queen of Sheba's palace. And they persecuted anyone who said otherwise. In 1962, archaeologist Peter Garlick published findings confirming African origins. The Rhodesian government banned his work. Teachers who mentioned African builders were disciplined. Tour guides at Great Zimbabwe were instructed to promote the colonial myth. This was Orwellian. The truth was visible in the stones themselves, in the pottery, in every artifact. But the lie was enforced by law. Why? Because Rhodesia was a white minority government ruling over a black majority. If Africans had built Great Zimbabwe, if they had created sophisticated civilizations, then what right did white colonizers have to rule them? Great Zimbabwe threatened the entire ideological foundation of white supremacy in southern Africa. So the lie continued. Through the 1960s. Through the 1970s. Even as African independence movement spread across the continent, white Rhodesia clung to its myths. But lies can't survive forever. Truth has a way of emerging. In 1973, the Rhodesian government finally, quietly, accepted that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. They had no choice. The archaeological evidence was overwhelming. The international community was condemning their racist pseudoscience. But they didn't advertise this admission. They didn't correct the textbooks. They just stopped actively promoting the lie, while allowing it to persist in public consciousness. And then, in 1980, everything changed. Zimbabwe gained independence. The white minority government fell. The new nation took its name from the ancient city. Great Zimbabwe wasn't just an archaeological site anymore. It was a symbol, a statement, a reclamation of stolen history. The first president, Robert Mugabe, said, "Great Zimbabwe stands as a monument to the greatness of our past. It is a symbol that proves we have always been a people capable of great achievements." The Zimbabwe birds, those sacred soapstone carvings from Great Zimbabwe, became the national symbol. On the flag, on currency, on government seals. Great Zimbabwe was home again. Its builders were finally acknowledged. The theft of history was undone. But the damage had been done. For a century, racism had corrupted archaeology. Truth had been suppressed. Heritage had been looted. And generations had been taught lies. The story of Great Zimbabwe isn't just about an ancient civilization. It's about how colonialism weaponizes history. How racism corrupts science. How power determines whose stories are told and whose are erased. So let's talk about what we actually know. The truth about Great Zimbabwe, based on decades of careful archaeological research, conducted properly, without racist agendas. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people between approximately 1100 and 1450 of the Common Era. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which at its height controlled vast territories in what is now Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and parts of South Africa and Botswana. The population at its peak was probably 10 to 20,000 people. That made it the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. Larger than London was in the 13th century. Comparable to major medieval European cities. The economy was based on cattle, agriculture, and trade. Cattle were wealth. Agriculture provided food. But trade, especially in gold, made the elite rich and powerful. The gold came from mines in the surrounding hills. Great Zimbabwe didn't have large-scale deep mining, but surface gold and shallow workings produced substantial quantities. This gold was traded to the East African coast, then onward to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The social structure was hierarchical. The king, called the Mombo, ruled from the hill complex. Below him were noble families, wealthy traders, religious specialists. Then craftspeople, farmers, herders. And at the bottom, laborers. This wasn't unusual. This is how most complex societies were organized. Great Zimbabwe was a kingdom, with all the social stratification that implies. The stonework is remarkable for several reasons. First, the scale. Building the great enclosure alone required moving and placing over 1 million granite blocks. That's an extraordinary feat of organization and labor. Second, the technique. The walls are built without mortar, using a dry stone technique. The builders selected stones that fit together naturally, creating stable structures that have lasted 7 centuries. Some walls have a slight inward slant, improving stability. Drainage channels prevent water damage. Third, the aesthetics. This wasn't just functional building. The herringbone patterns, the decorative towers, the carefully shaped entrances, these show artistic sensibility. The builders cared how it looked, not just whether it stood. Fourth, the variety. Different structures show different styles, suggesting evolution of technique over centuries. Early walls are simpler. Later constructions are more sophisticated. This shows continuous development, learning, improvement. The pottery found at Great Zimbabwe is distinctively African. The styles match those of surrounding regions. The designs, shapes, and techniques connect directly to other Southern African cultures. There's clear continuity from earlier periods and connection to later traditions. The iron tools show advanced metallurgy. The smiths of Great Zimbabwe could control furnace temperatures, create steel, and forge sophisticated implements. This wasn't primitive metalworking. This was skilled craftsmanship. The gold artifacts are beautiful. Delicate earrings, bracelets, and ornaments show precision and artistry. These weren't crude hammered pieces. These were carefully crafted jewelry. And then there's the trade. Archaeologists have excavated thousands of glass beads at Great Zimbabwe. These beads came from India, Persia, and Arabia. They found Chinese porcelain from the Song and Ming dynasties, Persian pottery, Arab coins, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. This proves beyond doubt that Great Zimbabwe was connected to international trade networks. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't primitive. It was cosmopolitan, linked to the wider world. The Zimbabwe birds are particularly significant. These 8 soapstone sculptures were found in the hill complex, positioned on pillars overlooking the sacred areas. Each depicts a bird, probably an eagle, perched on a column. The Shona people revere the fish eagle, which lives along rivers and calls with a distinctive cry. In Shona tradition, ancestors can take the form of birds. These sculptures likely represented messengers between the living and the ancestral realm. The birds were so important that when the colonial looters took them, the Shona people never forgot. After independence, the birds that had been scattered to museums and private collections were gradually returned. They are now in Zimbabwe, where they belong. The hill complex, perched on its granite outcrop, was clearly sacred space. The narrow passages, the hidden enclosures, the platforms with monoliths, these aren't just defensive features. They are designed to create an atmosphere of mystery and power. Kings would have performed rituals here, consulted ancestors, made offerings. The hill complex wasn't just a palace. It was a temple, a sacred mountain, a connection point between earth and sky, between the living and the dead. The great enclosure, with its massive walls and mysterious conical tower, served both practical and symbolic purposes. Yes, it provided privacy and security. But it also made a statement. It said, "We have the power to build this. We have the wealth to maintain it. We are permanent. We are important." Great Zimbabwe wasn't unique in Africa. It was part of a broader tradition of stone building in southern Africa. There are over 200 stone-walled sites scattered across Zimbabwe and neighboring countries. Great Zimbabwe was the largest and most sophisticated, but it wasn't alone. These sites showed that the stone building tradition was indigenous, African, developed locally over centuries. This wasn't imported technology. This wasn't foreign influence. This was African innovation. The decline of Great Zimbabwe around 1450 didn't mean the civilization disappeared. The people didn't vanish. They moved. They established new centers. The Mutapa Kingdom to the north. The Butwa and later Rosvi kingdoms to the southwest. These successor kingdoms continued many of Great Zimbabwe's traditions. Stone building, long-distance trade, cattle wealth, political hierarchy. They were the same culture, just in new locations. Even today, the Shona people maintain traditions connecting them to Great Zimbabwe. Oral histories speak of their ancestors building the stone city. Religious practices connect sacred sites to Great Zimbabwe. The continuity is unbroken. Modern archaeology, using radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and other scientific methods, has confirmed the timeline. Great Zimbabwe's main construction period was between 1200 and 1450. The artifacts found are consistent with this dating. The pottery styles match other dated sites. Everything fits. There is no mystery about who built Great Zimbabwe. No unsolved puzzle. The evidence is clear, consistent, and overwhelming. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, the ancestors of the Shona. It was a sophisticated civilization, wealthy, powerful, and culturally rich. It was connected to international trade. It developed remarkable architecture. It lasted for centuries. This is the truth. And the truth is magnificent. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized internationally as a place of outstanding universal value. A monument that belongs not just to Zimbabwe, but to all humanity. Thousands of tourists visit every year. They walk through the narrow passages of the hill complex. They stand before the massive walls of the great enclosure. They marvel at the conical tower. They see with their own eyes what African engineers and builders created 700 years ago. The site is protected by Zimbabwean law. Archaeologists continue to study it, using non-invasive techniques to learn more without damaging the structures. Conservation efforts work to preserve the stones from weathering and erosion. But Great Zimbabwe is more than a tourist attraction or archaeological site. It's a symbol, a source of national pride, a reminder of what Africans achieved long before colonization. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, naming the nation after this ancient city was a deliberate choice. It said, "We have history. We have heritage. We built great things. We are not defined by colonization." The Zimbabwe bird appears everywhere. On the flag, on coins and banknotes, on government documents, on businesses and schools. It's a unifying symbol, representing the nation's ancient roots. For young Zimbabweans, learning about Great Zimbabwe is learning about their own greatness. It counters the colonial narrative that Africans had no history worth knowing. It provides a source of pride and identity. But the site faces challenges. Economic difficulties in Zimbabwe have limited funding for conservation. Political instability has sometimes affected heritage protection. Climate change brings new threats, with changing rainfall patterns potentially affecting the stone structures. And unfortunately, the colonial myths haven't completely died. Even today, fringe groups and racist pseudo-historians continue to claim Great Zimbabwe was built by non-Africans. These claims have no academic support, no evidence, no credibility. But they persist in dark corners of the internet, spread by people who still can't accept African achievement. This is why telling Great Zimbabwe's story accurately is so important. Every time we say clearly, this was built by Africans. Every time we present the evidence, every time we honor the truth, we push back against the lie. The Shona people have always known the truth. Their oral traditions never forgot. Even during a century of colonial denial, they knew Great Zimbabwe was their ancestor city. They maintained their connection to it, despite being told they were wrong. There's a Shona proverb, "Chokofukidze Dzimba Megna." What covers the houses is thatch. It means, pay attention to what's obvious, don't look for complex explanations. Great Zimbabwe's builders were the obvious answer. The local people. The Africans who had lived in that region for centuries. Who had the skills, the motivation, the cultural traditions. Not mysterious foreigners from thousands of miles away. The truth was always obvious. Colonialism just refused to see it. Today, Great Zimbabwe reminds us of something crucial. Africa has always had history. Always had civilization. Always had achievements worthy of respect. For too long, world history has been taught as if nothing happened in Africa except colonization. As if Africans were passive recipients of history, not active creators. But Great Zimbabwe, along with Kush, the Nok, the Swahili cities, the empires of Mali and Songhai, the cities of Timbuktu and Jen, all prove that narrative is false. Africa was building civilizations while Europe was still emerging from the medieval period. Africa was creating art, architecture, literature, science, trade networks, political systems, all on its own terms, in its own ways. Great Zimbabwe is one chapter in that much larger story. But it's a crucial chapter. Because the attempted erasure of Great Zimbabwe, the century-long lie, shows how colonialism didn't just take land and resources. It tried to take history itself. But history can't be stolen forever. Truth endures. And Great Zimbabwe stands, silent and strong, testifying to African greatness. So what does Great Zimbabwe teach us? What's the meaning of this stone city and its contested history? First, it teaches us about African achievement. Great Zimbabwe proves that Africans built sophisticated civilizations, created remarkable architecture, participated in global trade, developed complex societies. This shouldn't be surprising. Humans are human everywhere. Africans are no less capable of building cities than Europeans, Asians, or anyone else. But because of centuries of racist propaganda, This basic truth needed archaeological proof. Great Zimbabwe provides that proof. Undeniable, visible, lasting. Second, it teaches us about the power of racism to corrupt knowledge. For a century, trained archaeologists, educated people, looked at clear evidence and denied what it showed. Why? Because accepting the truth would have undermined white supremacy. This is a warning. It shows how ideology can blind people to facts. How prejudice can corrupt even supposedly objective sciences like archaeology. Third, it teaches us about resilience. Despite a century of denial, despite looting and suppression, Great Zimbabwe's truth survived. The Shona people never forgot. And eventually, truth prevailed. This is hopeful. It means lies don't last forever. Even when power enforces the lie, even when the truth is inconvenient, eventually evidence wins. Fourth, it teaches us about the importance of heritage. Great Zimbabwe matters not just as an archaeological site, but as a source of identity and pride for Zimbabweans. It connects present to past. It grounds national identity in deep history. Every nation, every people, needs this connection. History isn't just facts about the past. It's a foundation for identity, a source of meaning, a way to understand who we are. Fifth, it teaches us that history is contested. The story we tell about the past has political implications. Who gets to tell that story matters. Whose perspective dominates matters. For too long, African history was told by Europeans, for European purposes. Great Zimbabwe's story was taken and rewritten. But independence meant reclaiming that story, telling it truthfully, from African perspectives. And finally, Great Zimbabwe teaches us about human capacity for greatness. The builders didn't have modern technology. No cranes. No machinery. No computers. Just human hands, human ingenuity, human cooperation. And they built something that has lasted 700 years. Something that still inspires awe. Something that speaks across centuries. That's what humans can do. That's what we're capable of. Regardless of where we are from, what color our skin is, what language we speak. Great Zimbabwe is a human achievement. An African achievement. A testament to what's possible when people work together toward a common vision. So this is the story of Great Zimbabwe. A stone city built by Africans. A capital of a wealthy trading kingdom. A sacred place connecting earth and sky. A remarkable achievement of engineering and artistry. And a civilization whose very existence was denied for a century, because accepting the truth would have undermined racism. But the stones endure. The walls still stand. The evidence is undeniable. And the truth can no longer be suppressed. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. The ancestors of the Shona. Between 1100 and 1450 of the Common Era. It was the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa. It controlled vast trade networks. It created remarkable architecture. It lasted for over 3 centuries. This is not a theory. This is not speculation. This is established historical fact, supported by decades of careful archaeological research. When you see images of Great Zimbabwe's massive stone walls, when you read about the conical tower, when you learn about the Zimbabwe birds, remember this. You're looking at African achievement, African engineering, African artistry. Remember that Europeans tried to erase this history. Tried to claim these achievements for anyone except Africans. And failed. Because truth endures. Evidence speaks. And stones remember. The next time someone suggests Africans had no history, no civilization, no achievements, tell them about Great Zimbabwe. Tell them about stone walls 11 meters high, built without mortar, standing for 7 centuries. Tell them about a city connected to trade networks spanning 3 continents. Tell them about a culture that created art, architecture, and a civilization that Europeans simply couldn't believe Africans were capable of building. Tell them that the inability to believe in African achievements says more about the prejudice of the doubters than the capabilities of Africans. Great Zimbabwe stands as proof. Visible, undeniable, magnificent. The builders of Great Zimbabwe didn't write down their names. They didn't leave written histories. But they left something better. They left stones. Stones that tell their story. Stones that prove their greatness. Stones that will stand long after all of us are gone. Their legacy is not just what they built, but what their achievement means. It means Africa has always been part of human civilization. Always been creating, building, innovating. Always been worthy of respect. This is one chapter in Africa's story. But it's a crucial one. Because it's a chapter that was almost erased, that had to be fought for, that had to be reclaimed. And now it belongs to the world. Great Zimbabwe isn't just Zimbabwean heritage. It's African heritage. It's human heritage. It's a reminder of what we are capable of, all of us, when we work together towards something greater than ourselves. The stones stand. The truth endures. And Great Zimbabwe will inspire generations to come. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. Which ancient African civilization should I explore next? The Empire of Mali. The Swahili Coast. Ancient Ethiopia. The kingdoms of West Africa. The past is calling. And Africa's history is vast, rich, and waiting to be told. Until next time, this has been a journey back to ancient Africa.